It's 13th century Scotland. Sonny Bean just married and has set up his new home in Benane Cave. His trade as a tanner hasn't been going well, so when times turn tough, Sonny turns to robbery. His new life of crime turns out to be a lucrative one, but he worries that his victims will turn him in. Murder seems to be both an easy and convenient solution. However, murder poses a new problem. What to do with all those bodies? Again, Sonny Bean comes up with an easy solution, one that provides both a way to dispose of the bodies and provide a high-protein diet for his new wife. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is Season 2, Episode 11, and this is the second episode of our series on cannibals. If you're just joining us, you may want to go back and listen to the last episode first.
So Mel couldn't join us tonight, so it's just Matt and myself, and we are continuing our discussion on cannibals. And the opening to this episode was The Legend of Sonny Bean, which some of you may be familiar with, and I hope I pronounced all the Scottish places correctly. I probably did not, so excuse me for my southern accent bungling that up. But The Legend of Sonny Bean is an interesting one, and it's been turned into stories and ballads, and it's pretty popular, I think, at this point. But one of the things that's interesting about the Sonny Bean legend is that his story kind of continues as he and his wife have children, and those children grow up in a cave eating mostly human meat. And so the legend, as it continues on, tells of these children who then grow up and begin to have children amongst themselves. So they're this incest bred clan that develops, and they just basically lay in wait for the innocent passerby to come too close to their cave and murder and eat them. And the end of the legend says that the family had eventually grown to 48 members. So they go from the original 2 to 48, and they're eventually brought to the king and put to death. Of course, historians have gone through all their reasons why this is just a legend and never actually happened, but it's one of the most popular ones. There's another one called The Legend of Christy Cleek, which is very similar to the Sonny Bean story, and it inspired similar ballads and tales. And both Sonny Bean and Christy Cleek have become these kind of Scottish boogeymen, you know, meant to scare children into behaving, I think, more than anything. But they've gone on to inspire what we would consider, I think, classic cannibal fare, things like The Hills Have Eyes. Matt, I don't know if you've seen that or if you're a fan of it the way I am, but I feel like talking about this subject, we have to talk about movies like The Hills Have Eyes.
Oh, yeah. And, I mean, I'm pretty sure that you and I and several other people went and saw the remake of The Hills Have Eyes. I'm relatively certain that it was like a big group of us years ago.
We did.
And I distinctly remember, just as kind of a side note to the Hills Have Eyes remake, purchasing my ticket and the guy at the movie theater who, you know, at the ticket window saying, "Oh, you know, it's really gross, it's really disturbing." You know, somebody had to leave during one showing to go throw up, and so I'm all excited. And I remember after the movie ended, going, "Well, that was it." So, not that it wasn't gory and gruesome and whatnot, but certainly nothing that triggered any sort of urge to go run and throw up. So.
Yeah. I had a couple of thoughts about the remake of that because now that you mention it, I remember it very vividly now. With the remake, one thing that I thought was really interesting is how they had the new kind of nuclear testing ground opening sequence that was added into the remake, and how that was almost more interesting than the entire movie. On the fact that they did that, but also that in particular, these kind of cannibal movies where they go off into, for lack of a better word, like no man's land. These movies where they go into uncivilized wilderness, I guess that is the word I'm looking for, tend to be better the lower budget they are and the lower on the technology scale they are. Because when you start to get too high tech with some of these things, it loses a bit of its gruesomeness, I guess.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I mean, thinking about the original Hills Have Eyes or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or plenty of other similar type movies. I think once you start adding too much high techness to it, it does kind of lose some of its. I don't know what the word for it is, but something.
Right. Well, I will say this: the original The Hills Have Eyes. It's one of my favorite movies. What was that? 1978. Wes Craven, I think, or 1977. Sounds more, anyway, around there, 77, 78, has one of the best lines, maybe in all of cinema. And that's when the daughter, when they're stranded early on in the film, says, "We're gonna be French fries, human French fries."
Oh, that's great because, I mean, so many levels, especially since, French fries are a vegetarian fare, so...
Right. And in a way, that's exactly what they're going to become.
Mm-hmm.
But and again, you'll have to excuse me for not knowing. I should have looked up the name of this, but there's an actual filmmaking term for when one of the characters in like the first act will state the theme of the movie. And I thought, you know what? That does it really well, and it captures the dark humor of it, and you know exactly what's going to happen because here she is worried about, I guess, getting a sunburn or frying out in the desert, and in a very real sense, they're about to become human food. So I remember, I think I saw the original as an adult, and I remember watching it when it got to that line, I thought, you know what, I'm really going to like this movie.
Well, I guess to kind of bring this around back to kind of our main point and our intro with Mr. Sonny Bean, as you said, that he does seem to be this kind of inspiration for these types of movies. And I mean, if we were to pin down the theme for this particular episode, it's about the idea of when the cannibals are monsters, right? Like when they are this external thing, much like the mutants or the inbred people, depending on which version of Hills Have Eyes you're talking about. They are these. You can't reason with them. They're going to try to eat you no matter what. They're not going to listen to you because they're practically inhuman. Practically, but not completely.
Right, because that's one of the earmarks, I guess, of these type of movies is that, I mean, first of all, for it to be cannibalism, it has to be humans eating other humans. That's the very basic definition. But with a lot of these cannibal movies, there is a very firm line drawn in the sand between those who do it and those who do not. And so it becomes an us versus them, or even kind of an otherness that makes up the cannibals. So they're always these kind of, at least in this brand of cannibal narrative. We're going to talk about different cannibal narratives in our next episode. But when you're looking at cannibals as being the monsters, they're always something that makes them very different from us. Either they're uncivilized, they've been removed from civilization for so long that they don't understand it anymore, or they're so severely inbred that we can't expect them to understand that what they're doing is wrong. Or, as you pointed out, Matt, with the remake of The Hills Have Eyes, that there's some sort of radiation poisoning and mutation that's gone on, that's made them something other than just purely human. So these cannibals, we don't recognize necessarily as being just like us. And yeah, I think Sonny Bean does kind of nail it down, because not only do you have these people who have willingly taken themselves away from society, but you have them being products of incest, they're literally cave dwelling. So they're almost more akin to animals than to humans at that point. And so maybe not with Sonny Bean and his wife, who we're assuming came from some sort of civilization. I mean, he lived in a town and he had a trade, and I guess life just got so tough they decided to pull themselves away from that. But you see this narrative of people who have pulled themselves away from society, and in doing that, lose grip on what makes them human. And so that's what turns them into the monster that is now stalking the story.
Right. And I mean, even with Sonny Bean, he begins as an outcast, as a murderer, as a highwayman, and then leads into this. So, I mean, even from the get-go, he's not on the up and up as far as civilization would be concerned, right? And then, well, like you said, you've got these incestuous cave-dwelling outsiders that are committing these social taboos. And I mean, cannibalism, like we talked about in the last episode, is obviously a major taboo in pretty much almost all human societies, but so is incest as well. And not just because it's icky to sleep with your family members, but because it causes legitimate, actual birth defects and problems. I mean, I was actually... I don't remember where it was. It was somewhere on the internet, because, you know, the internet's a wild, wonderful, crazy place. But I stumbled into some sort of internet hole and was looking at portraits of the Habsburgs, the European aristocrats from, you know, many, many centuries that were, over time, products of inbreeding. And, like, if you look at them, like, apparently they even have this... they call it the Habsburg lip, because they were so inbred that all of them had these crazy, the same basic mouth is what it looks like. But you look at it and go, oh my gosh, oh wow, that just looks wrong. And it's because of all the incest in order to keep the bloodline pure, basically. And, you know, now we always seem to have these sort of outsider stories involving these incestuous relationships. I remember there was a very similar episode to sort of The Hills Have Eyes, an episode of The X-Files, where there was inbred people that were out on the frontier somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. And I don't think that they were cannibals. It's been a long time since I've seen it, but same sort of thing. They were these outside, almost monster things. I mean, they were monstrous for sure, but yeah.
Yeah. That was the episode that they banned, wasn't it? I think it kind of lived on, and now I'm blanking on the name of the episode, but they showed it as part of their regular season, the X-Files did, and then they pulled it because people, I think, were so shocked by the nature of it. And it became one of those episodes. Of course, now, thanks to the internet, like you said, you can find anything, and that episode is now readily available. And I think pretty much everybody has seen it. Home, that may be the name of it.
It is.
Home? Yeah.
It looks like it wasn't banned, but it was, let's see. It was the first episode of The X-Files to receive a viewer discretion warning for graphic content, and the only one to have a TVMA rating. So
there you go. Okay. Yeah.
So it may have been...
I knew it had some special distinction.
Right. It may have been left out in syndication because they didn't want to... maybe it wasn't banned, but because of the MA rating, you know, the channels that were syndicating it didn't want to deal with that at like 4 p.m. when people, you know, come home and watch the X-Files on TNT and, oh, TVMA.
Right. Yeah, that may be it. It may just not have made it into syndication, because I remember I did not see it because I did not watch the X-Files when it was during its first run. I was one of these who found it later and did watch it in syndication. So I had never seen this episode until the wonderful world of the internet, and I could see things on Netflix. But yeah, I remember when I watched it wondering why it was so taboo or scary. But I think it was a couple of things. It was the idea of incest, because as you said, it kind of along the lines of cannibalism, we just find it gross. But the fact that the monsters turned out to be human, and I feel like that was one of the plot points that they played up in the episode, is when they realized that they're not dealing with a typical run-of-the-mill monster, that they're just dealing with a incredibly uncivilized, for lack of a better word, family. A family with some really deep-rooted issues. And I think that was where a lot of the horror lay in that episode. And I think that's what a lot of these cannibal movies kind of hit at too.
Well, I totally agree with that assessment of it, especially this idea of it being through no fault of their own. You know, that in some cases, if there has been so many generations of incest that these I don't know what to call them. I mean, they're people, but I don't know what to call them. But they definitely wouldn't know any better, so to speak. And I think that was one of the themes of that particular episode of the X-Files, was that one of the quote unquote creatures that they find is practically an innocent, in the sense of it's very childlike and very, you know, Mulder and Scully sort of take a liking to it, I guess, for lack of a better word. It's been a very long time since I've seen the episode, and I really should have watched it in preparation for this, but it didn't occur to me until we actually started this recording that I thought, oh yeah, that episode of the X-Files. So, you know.
Well, yeah, I understand, because they weren't cannibals per se, but
right.
It definitely fits into the Hills Have Eyes and Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibe of
For
things.
sure. And I was even thinking of, and another one of those things where I'm just completely drawing a blank, but that movie from about 10, 12 years ago that was about the group of people that are spelunking in the cave and end up getting chased down by mutant people. Do you remember the name of that movie? Because
The Descent.
Yes, I knew it started with a D. I kept trying to say The Deepness. No, The Dark. No, it's something with a D. Thank you. The Descent. I mean, for me, that movie, the scariest parts of it were the claustrophobic, tight shots of the cave stuff, and I was more freaked out by that than them being chased by the bat-like, you know, sonar clicking inbred humanoids. But I wanted to throw that out there, too, as a similar thing, because those, I mean, I don't know what to call them. I almost said those monsters, but they're not monsters, but they kind of are. I mean, they're monstrous, I think I said earlier, and I think that's probably the best fit for what, you know, the villains in the Hills Have Eyes and the villains in The Descent would be, because they're descended from humans, and in most cases, they're pretty much human, except because of a generation or two of inbreeding along with the cannibalism, they've become this, well, like you said earlier, they've become this sort of external force. And yeah, I mean, people who live outside of society are often used as these sort of warning signs and scaremongering tactics, or even become the butts of jokes, you know, but like that movie Deliverance. You know, you've got Burt Reynolds and his friends going on this river adventure, and they get attacked by rednecks, basically. And, you know, I would say it's probably not too far of a thread to say that the rednecks in a lot of people's minds are viewed fairly similarly as the inbred people from the original Hills Have Eyes. You know, they're fairly close, and we have lots of inbreeding jokes about rednecks. That's for sure. Not that I'd say 98% of rednecks aren't inbred; they're just country folk, you know. But these people that live outside the margins of society, that aren't just the rednecks that live out in the country, but like people that are really beyond the margins of society, have this fear attached to them. Either they're going to attack you, or they're going to possibly eat you. I mean, you can see how these stories could evolve from, you know, don't go out in the woods because there's people out there that we don't know and they may hurt you, to, oh, there are these scary people out there, to they're cannibals, they might eat it. You know, like this evolutionary sociological story, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we have a tendency to turn them into the boogeyman, and that may be, as you said, kind of, there may be a rather innocent reason, you know, kind of warning people away from a certain place because, you know, hey, just letting you know there are people out there. Don't be fooled into thinking that you're alone, to how it can morph into something that's bigger than itself. One of the really interesting things, though, I think in particular about these type of stories where you have, and I'm using air quotes as I say this, an uncivilized group of people that are out, as you said, way beyond what we would consider the cutoff for civilization, not just, rural area people, but, much, much further beyond that. One of the things that's interesting about these stories is that often, kind of in the way that maybe zombie tales or post-apocalyptic tales, anything where you have civilization being threatened, it's really easy to put a spotlight on how even civilized people can very quickly turn uncivilized. And a lot of these stories, The Descent is a perfect example of that, because, gosh, that movie was so tense. And I was like you, Matt, that movie could have just been the first third, and I would have thought it was about the scariest thing I've ever seen. And, just where they're in the caves, and you don't even know that there are monsters down there, because just the claustrophobia alone, I remember watching it in the theater and finding it hard in certain scenes to breathe, like to physically breathe, because it bothered me so much. But then you have the added threat of there's something out there. There's something out there that wants to harm us, or at least protect itself from us. And then beyond that, you start seeing the group of women start to turn on each other. And they've brought in all these outside conflicts into the cave that are now coming to a head. And I find that a lot of these type of stories tend to do that. With Sonny Bean and Christy Cleek, you have a pretty straightforward traditional narrative of there are these boogeymen out in the woods that will get you. But when you look at some of the stories that they've inspired, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. And I don't know if you ever read Off Season.
I have not, but please, by all means, talk about it.
Okay. So I feel like we have to talk about it. I was preparing to talk about this anyway for this episode. Off Season, that's the 1980 book by Jack Ketchum. And Jack Ketchum is the pseudonym for Dallas Mayer, who passed away actually just 3 days ago from the time we're recording this. So on January 24th, which was an incredible loss, I think, for the book community. But he wrote this book called Off Season. And just a little bit of background. It was originally published with Ballantine in 1980. And it went through its own drama because they edited it heavily because of the gore and the just, I think, horrific nature of some of the events that were described in the book. And he was definitely inspired by Sonny Bean, and you'll see why in just a minute. Later in 1999, Cemetery Dance Publications put out a new version of it that was unedited. So you can find that version. But the story is about, it's kind of your typical, it's very similar to Deliverance in its tone, where there's a group of men who go out into the woods. They leave the city to go on vacation and kind of have a back to nature camping trip. And they go to this place called Dead River, Maine. But it very much feels like it could be, the Tennessee mountains or like Appalachian country or, anywhere like that is extremely remote. And they encounter a family of cannibals, very similar again to the Sonny Bean legend, where there's been a family who's been living there for decades or centuries, maybe even. And so much so that they're barely recognizable as human. They live in caves, and they're wearing animal skins, and they're covered in dirt and grime. But very quickly, these men have to, in order to fight off their attackers, have to become equally as savage. And I won't go into the details because I highly recommend going and finding the book and reading it. But one of the really interesting things is he wrote a sequel called The Offspring. And it's about the family that's out in the woods, the cannibal family. And then that spawned a movie that came out a few years ago called The Woman, which was made by Lucky McKee with Jack Ketchum. And The Woman is fantastic. And it's basically about, she's the last remaining people of this clan. Like, they've all been killed off. And so you can imagine being the last surviving member of your family and not knowing about really how to integrate with civilization. And a man finds her, and he's your typical kind of suburban, super macho, a little bit chauvinistic, or a lot chauvinistic, I guess. And he finds her and decides that he is going to civilize her, which basically means locking her up in his basement and doing horrible things to her to teach her how to be a real human again. And so it kind of follows this narrative. If you go from off-season to the offspring to the woman becomes the victim in it, and civilization becomes the monsters. So it kind of flips that script in a very interesting way. And in doing, I had seen The Woman when it came out. I think it was 2011 when it came out. But the husband's name, the father who takes the woman in, his character's name is Chris Cleek. So it's kind of a hearkening back to the Christy Cleek legend and the Sawney Bean. Anyway, it's a really fascinating, that whole storyline that he goes through, going from the 1980 off-season all the way through to the 2011 movie. I highly recommend it. I don't want to go into too much detail. I love it.
Well, you've sold me on it. I'm definitely interested in reading it now. That's for sure.
But yeah, that's all just to say that these kind of stories, when they're done well, will typically make you question who the monster really is. And is that line that we draw in the sand of we are civilized and you are not. It's easy to look at somebody and say, well, you live in a cave and you're sleeping with your brother and you're eating human meat. Like, I'm not like you. But is it really that far of a leap before we do become the monsters in that? Especially when you take a look at like the violence and what we have to do, or I guess what the characters have to do to protect themselves.
Well, and that kind of even overlaps with our last episode when we were talking about what people need to do to survive in terms of like natural disasters or accidents, like the Donner Party, or I don't remember if we said it specifically, but that soccer team that was the basis for the movie Alive, where they ended up having to resort to cannibalism to stay alive. I mean, it's not that far of a leap to take that kind of natural disaster survival to this other kind of survival here as well. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing.
It is. And it really is when you look at these narratives where the cannibals are presented as the other, that they're something that's very different from us. Because in some of these stories, they really are monstrous. Like the Reavers from Firefly. Those are the things of nightmares. And I had to go back in preparation for this episode and doing research, and I was like, were the Reavers really as bad as I'm remembering? And I came across that one line that Zoe said when they introduced them, and which she says, if they take the ship, they'll rape us to death, eat our flesh, and sew our skins into their clothing. And if we're very, very lucky, they'll do it in that order. And when I reread that line, I thought, yeah, they're about as bad as you can get for monsters. And then, the whole reveal is that, no, they're just people who have lived on the edge of space for too long. They've been too removed from civilization.
Well, there is another big reveal at the end of the movie Serenity.
Yeah.
But
which we won't go into for too much if you haven't seen it, but
if you haven't, what have you been doing with your life? Because Firefly and Serenity are If I may make another quick side note, Serenity is one of those few movies that if I am like flipping through the channels and it is on, I can't stop and watch it unless I know that I have time to finish the entire thing because I love it that much. Anyway, but yeah, as far as the Reavers themselves, for those of you familiar with the Firefly / Serenity universe, yeah, I mean, I kind of did the same thing as we were, preparing this series and talking about, ideas, and the Reavers, of course, popped up in our planning. And I had the same question, like, were they really that bad? And I actually went back and watched just a scene from the TV show, because I have it on DVD, of course, and just watched some of the and I was like, wow, yeah, this is pretty crazy, even especially for a show that was on Fox in the early 2000s. Never mind what they did in the movies. And it's not like they show too much, but just the thematic gruesomeness, if that makes sense. They are literal monsters. And
yes,
and yeah, that line that they have, I believe it's in one of the first episodes when they introduce them, about how, like you said, that they've lived on the edge of space for too long, and I don't remember which character, I think it's Mal, says that they looked out into the space and saw nothing, and that's what drove them mad. Like, that has always kind of resonated with me, about this idea of being too far removed from civilization and what that can do to a person. I mean, you even think of something like a movie like Castaway, where you've got Tom Hanks, who is removed from civilization for so long and is desperately trying to hold on to what makes him human. I would say that's as much thematically in common with what we're talking about as the Reavers or the Hills Have Eyes, that edge of civilization and beyond. And at what point do you lose what makes you human,
This is a little bit of a side note from what we've been talking about, but I'm incredibly impressed that you just connected the Reavers to Tom Hanks.
Well, not Tom Hanks himself. I've heard nothing but great things about the man Tom Hanks, but the movie Castaway, yes.
Yeah, no, I always feel like that's a much darker movie than people give it credit for, because so much of it, when he is on the island, is trying to just desperately hold on to his humanity.
Right, and I think too, it didn't occur to me even really until just now, but so I wish I could go back in time about 20 minutes so I could insert this into the proper part of this recording. But when we were talking about this idea of people like Sawney Bean's children, the products of incest, or the people from the Hills Have Eyes, isn't it a lot like the kids that were raised by wolves in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that, like, one of them was even kind of a subject of Freud, this idea that, these kids on this farmland wander away, they grow up outside of civilization, and I think there were at least 2 documented cases of people that were found afterwards, and one of them had been away from humanity and civilization long enough that his brain had developed in such a way that he was never able to really communicate and speak, because he'd never grown up around humans. Like, he could kind of grunt and do sort of a sign language sort of thing, but he never learned how to talk because he missed that crucial part of socialization that happens at the time when your brain is capable of processing it. Now, I mean, if you're a psychologist and I am way off base, please don't correct me. I want to continue thinking that I'm right. No, I'm just joking. But I believe that's the case, if I remember correctly. And I mean, that's the same sort of thing we're talking about, these people that are on the fringes of humanity, so to speak. And it really raises that deeper question of what makes us human. Is civilization a part of it? And I would, in some ways, argue, yes, we're social creatures. Apparently, we have to be around each other to learn language.
Yeah. Well, that you make a good point, and it does bring up the idea too of what makes us human and what is okay, I guess. Because it's easy when you start to watch these. We were just talking about the Reavers, for instance. They're monsters. They're horrible, and even if you take away, what happened and what we learned in the movie Serenity, they're scary. They're scary. They've got these, they almost remind me of Cenobites or something. Their face is all mutilated and they've cut on themselves, and they're just these gross looking things, and everybody's afraid of them. And you get the sense that, yeah, we are social creatures and that's what happens. Because I think it was Mal who said, yeah, they went mad, they went crazy. They looked into the void and looked away from us for too long. Basically, they were away from humanity for too long. And there's this idea that they can't come back from where they are. But then when you also look at the other monster in Firefly, which is kind of the central planets, right? The leaders of the central planets and the whole kind of sleek government people and the 2x2 hands of blue, they do equally horrific things, especially when you look at a character like River and what she's been through. And then you start to wonder, well, like, are the Reavers monsters because they've lost their humanity? Like, what makes us human? Because it's not just, as you said, that social aspect of it. There's something deeper to them. I don't know. I don't really know if what I'm saying it right now is making sense, but
No, it is. It is. Although I will be quite honest, I did just do a quick Google search of children raised by wolves, and as soon as we're done recording this episode, I'm going to fall into a deep Google hole. This is fascinating stuff. But
no, that was a big deal, like you said. In fact, there were people who I'm pretty sure were frauds, but who came saying, like, I found this wolf boy, basically, and look, I've civilized him. And, they had him, basically on display like a traveling show. Look, he's playing the piano. He's doing a dance. He's, like, well, you probably just found some poor random kid who needed money, but, they liked the idea of the wolf boy.
Right, or you're taking advantage of someone who is simply born with, like, special needs, not someone who is raised by wolves, but who just is, maybe, has something else wrong, like a birth defect or something. But anyway, before, because I'm looking at the time and we're sort of running down the clock, we haven't mentioned a pretty seminal movie in all of this, except in passing, and that's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I feel like we can't just leave that be with this episode and not talk about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
That's true. And, speaking of the remake of Hills Have Eyes, there was the remake of, well, there were many, but there was one that came out shortly, at least around the same time as that, of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Didn't see it. I have no intention of seeing it. The original is all that matters. I'm sorry.
Yes, you are correct in that, but we should at least point out that it has been remade and redone and rebooted and sequeled and so yeah, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That is the perfect example of someone who has been out of civilization for far too long and what happens when you stop in the wrong place. I mean that the story is essentially Sonny Bean, just set in Texas.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, and which came first, Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Hills Have Eyes? I feel like I should know this, but
I want to say it's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Give me a minute and I'll look it up.
Yeah, Texas Chainsaw Massacre did come out first. It came out in 1974. So, I mean, I dare say that it's almost the template for these movies that follow. You've got Hills Have Eyes, and then, of course, much, much later, around the time of the Hills Have Eyes remake, you've even got Rob Zombie with his homage, The House of a Thousand Corpses, which, it's just, I like Rob Zombie, and I saw what he was doing with it, but it just felt derivative because of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is just such a seminal movie for this kind of genre of a slasher with, like, crazy outsiders and the cannibalism and, the iconic character of Leatherface. And, yeah, I mean, it's, I brought it up, and I was the one that said we should talk about it. I don't know what else to say, except it's just so...
good.
well, and influential, I guess, is the word I'm looking for too. Yeah. It just in this genre.
And this was one of those. It very famously was based on the Ed Gein serial killer case, which Yes, it was. But I'm kind of with you. I see more of a Sonny being Christy Cleek mythology to it because it feels like a legend. It feels like a myth. And I think one of the things that was so terrifying about it is that Leatherface in particular seems to kill without thought, really. That was one of the things that terrified me about that movie was, you saw this group of young people who get stopped in very rural Texas, kind of the idea of there's no one around to hear you scream type of place. And the moment they go up to the house, it's a nonstop slaughter show. And you get the impression that, okay, it would not have mattered who stopped by. They would have just been disposed of. And that was, I think, what the terror of it was. And probably, I think, what the terror of a lot of these stories that were inspired by or are similar to the Sonny Bean legend or the Christy Cleek legend is that it seems so indiscriminatory. There's a person out there who does this, and this is what he does. This is who he is. And again, that fits into this idea of otherness about these monsters, about this type of killer, that they don't care who their victim is, as long as it's not part of their own family. If you're not part of the family, then you are the other to them, and that makes you fair game. And I won't even go into just the brilliance of some of the shots of the movie and how so much of the violence takes place off screen, and that somehow adds to the terror of what's happening. You don't need a whole lot of gore, which is very different from some of the other things that came later, off season one in particular. But a lot of the violence was off stage in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but that's because the scenery and the way the scenes were shot were so evocative that you didn't need that. It just happened in your head. Like, all the violence and blood and gore, for the most part, happened in your imagination, which makes it, again, adds to the terror of it.
Well, and I think the Greeks and even Shakespeare kind of had it right sometimes by having a lot of the violence on those plays happen off stage because, well, like you said, having it happen in your head can sometimes make things 10 times worse because you're sitting there thinking, what did I miss? What did I not see? What did they do? Like
right.
what happened? How did this person end up on a meat hook? In this case. So yeah. And I think you're absolutely right too about this idea of how Leatherface in particular, well, and the whole family kills indiscriminately. It didn't matter who those kids were. They were going. Right. They were dead the moment they rang the doorbell, so to speak. Once they approached that house, I mean, it could have been anyone, and they would have tried to kill them. And that's, I think, a big part of where the horror of that comes from. I totally agree with that. That it's, that idea that these horrific things can strike out of the blue. And this is an extreme example, but, I don't think anybody that's ever been mugged thought that was going to happen to them when they woke up that day, or anyone who's ever been in a car accident or anything else that could also be seemingly indiscriminate. Like I said, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, an extremely extreme example, but in that way of this indiscriminateness that...
Well, I completely agree with you, but you're also taking the point of view of the victim, because I think it becomes a different story when you look at it from the family's perspective, because part of that indiscriminate killing is that they're just doing what they do. There was that great movie, which I'm not going to talk about now because I want to save it for our next episode, but We Are What We Are, which is about a family of cannibals. And I think you see them from a little bit more of a sympathetic light. But when you look at Leatherface and his family, I mean, number one, Leatherface seems to be somebody who has been stunted because of how he grew up. Now, I don't know, how much of that was intentional, that maybe you're dealing with somebody who, kind of in this same way when we were talking about products of incest or boys who are raised by wolves are stunted in that way. But you get the idea that he cannot live out in civilized society. just because of the way he is and the way he was raised. And he's just doing what he's always done. This is just a way of life for him. And there's that perfect scene, which is one of the reasons that the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre holds such a fond place in my heart, and why I think, Tobe Hooper was such a genius in doing this. But in that, that scene where at the very end, you see the woman getting away and she's kind of cackling and you wonder if she'll ever be okay, kind of escaping this madhouse. But then you see Leatherface almost dancing with the chainsaw swirling above his head. And it's almost like you see the exuberance. And when you look at it from his point of view, what he was doing was just in line with what he's always done. And you may think I'm insane for even saying this, but there was just kind of a beauty and a joy about that moment in the movie. And it makes you look at, is he just pure monster, or is there not humanity in there too? Even though it's not a humanity I readily recognize, because I certainly would not chase after people who came to my door with a chainsaw or put them up on meat hooks. But there is a type of humanity and a type of civilization. It's just foreign to what we know. So I don't know, if you look at it from his point of view and not necessarily the poor boys and girls who happened to knock on the wrong door that day. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, remind me not to go to any dinner parties at your place.
I love that. I love that final scene.
It's a great scene. It's
Yeah.
iconic, and I don't want to wrench us away from that too much, but I did also want to throw out one final movie that, again, I don't want us to be getting bombarded with emails and angry tweets that we didn't mention it at all, but the movie Cannibal Holocaust. I mean, if we're going to talk about films that have cannibals as an other and cannibals who have people at the margins of society, well, why not have this, uncivilized tribe of people that are killing and eating people, right?
Yeah, and we probably don't have time to really discuss it in depth, but that's a perfect segue from what I was just talking about with Leatherface, because when you look at any of those, Cannibal Holocaust, any of the ones that came, I mean, oh my gosh, there were numerous ones that followed and that were right around the same time period. And even the Eli Roth Green Inferno, which came out a few years ago, which it was not necessarily worth talking about here. But yeah, it is the idea of these cannibals as other. And I think when we watch it, we find the terror because we relate to the white people going in there. Quite honestly, we relate to, whether they are scientists or researchers going in or a film crew going in to film. We relate to them, and we see horror in the fact that they're being slaughtered. However, if you look at it from the other point of view, well, here are people who've just kind of been minding their own business and doing what they always do, a lot like Leatherface sitting in his house in Texas. He wasn't going out searching for them. They walked into his home. And in a way, you could look at it as he was defending off an attack from outsiders. And so I think it's easy to look at the cannibals in these stories as the other and as the monster, but often it's the people who are invading their space who get killed in the end. And sometimes you have to wonder, well, maybe they shouldn't have been doing that. Maybe they should not have been just feeling like they could walk wherever they wanted to go. See, what I'm really trying to do defending these cannibals is offer a nice transition into our next episode, because this episode was all about when cannibals are the monsters. Next episode, we're going to be talking about when cannibals are a little bit more like us, and when it's not so easy to distinguish their otherness from our humanity. Specifically, I know some of you have been wondering why we have now gone through 2 full episodes on cannibals and we haven't mentioned the name of the most famous or maybe infamous cannibals of them all, Hannibal the Cannibal. Don't you worry. We've got that planned. And I think he's the perfect example of somebody who can very easily pass as just a quote unquote normal human with some rather monstrous tendencies. So I really hope that you join us for our next episode, which will actually be our last installment for Cannibal series, when we look at when cannibals are humans just like us.